right. Well, thank you again for that introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've sort of snuck into a more Sufi-oriented sort of academic space here, so I appreciate you giving me the chance to speak on this topic. If someone can see a more direct connection between what I'm presenting on and the more usual types of topics, please let me know during the Q&A. Maybe there's sort of a connection that I haven't yet grasped. But regardless, I appreciate the chance to present the research. So I'll just jump to the contents here. So I'm going to be talking about, as the title suggests, a sort of modern myth. This is sort of what we might call an Orientalist myth or an academic myth. It's a myth that exists among modern scholars, if you see what I'm saying, about the Qur'an. And it's about an aspect of the history of the Qur'an, about a sort of some kind of Proto-Qur'anic composition. I'll go into it in just a moment. But just to give a bit of context, so to begin with, I just want to make a comment on Surah Al-Baqarah, right? It's the second surah in the canonical text. It's really the first main surah. Once you get past the opening, Al-Fatiha, it's Surah Al-Baqarah as far as the eye can see, right? It's the longest surah and it contains legal content. Now you might be asking, well, yeah, of course, this is all pretty obvious. We'll come back to this at the very end. I just wanted to sort of acknowledge some basic features about Surah Al-Baqarah. We'll come back to that later. So, Aydoğan mentioned that I have a forthcoming tripartite series of articles with the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. And the part one is about to be published. I've just been sent the proofs. That article. The article is about the debate over who canonized the Quran, right? Obviously, the Islamic tradition is unanimous that it was Uthman, 20 to 30 years after Muhammad. There is there's been a string of revisionist scholars in the Western Academy for the last 100 years, since 11, who have argued that actually it was under Abdul Malik, and in particular on the undertaken by his infamous lieutenant Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the Quran was actually collected or canonized. And so my article is sort of focusing on that and the arguments for and against these positions, and arguing very, very strongly. It was definitely, the traditional view is basically correct. It was very likely Uthman who canonized the Quran, and all of these sort of revisionist arguments are just extremely weak. And so what I'm today is sort of an aspect of that research. It's an aspect of the argumentation we're passing in the article, but I want to sort of focus on it more squarely in this presentation. And this is to do with the book of the cow, right? This is sort of there's a hypothesis that there was this book and Al-Hajjaj were the ones who collected and canonized the Quran. You could view, obviously, you could just view this as its own sort of isolated hypothesis about something that existed, but it's usually, in practice, this is really a subset of this broader debate about whether or not the Quran was canonized by Uthman or under Abdul Malik. So what is this Book of the Cow? What's the hypothesis? A series of authors, Patricia Kroner, Alfred Louis Dubrema, Guillaume D, and most recently Stephen Shoemaker in his book Creating the Quran, have all argued, and there are maybe one or two others as well, have argued that there was a pre-canonical, pre-collected, free-floating proto-surah called Surah Al-Baqarah that was still circulating autonomously as late as the year 700 CE. In other words, as late as the year 700 CE, the Quran is not yet collected. It's still a kind of diffuse pre-collected corpus, and so, or it's only partially collected, and so essentially Surah Al-Baqarah, there was some kind of, or had some sort of autonomous existence, that it was this, there was some sort of proto-Surah Al-Baqarah still flying around, as late as the year 700. And so obviously this would show that the Quran was not yet canonized. It wasn't even collected, around the year 700, right? So this, you can see how this is then used as a sort of a pillar for the view that actually it was under Abdul Malik that the Quran was collected and canonized, right? So I want to look at some of the sources that are sort of cited in favor of this view. And not all of these authors cite all of these sources, but all of these sources are variously cited by these authors. So to begin with, we have a sort of a slogan. It's a rallying cry or a battle cry that is attributed to the Prophet, or that the Prophet reportedly told his uncle Al-Abbas to give this rallying cry during the Battle of Hunain. And it's also, this is, O companions of the Surah of the Cow. And so this is also attributed to the Battle of Al-Yamama against Musaylama, or I guess his real name was Maslama, but against the so-called false prophet Maslama. Again, the Muslims reportedly used this as their battle cry, O companions of the Surah of the Cow. And there's also a more elaborate version as well. O companions of the cow, O companions of the acacia tree on the day of Al-Hudaybiyah, O emigrants, O helpers, O Banu al-Khazraj. So this is interpreted as evidence that the Quran is not yet collected, that Al-Baqarah is still its own discrete text, something that is worth citing on its own separately from anything else, right? This is the reason why this is cited by some of these scholars. At some point in time, we'll sort of come back to this, because you can sort of see it's a bit odd to use it like this, because it's set during the time of the Prophet and the time of Abu Bakr, before the Quran has been canonized. So, but anyway, it's still, nevertheless, it's cited by Dupremin to try and as sort of evidence for the existence of a kind of pre-canonical, free-floating Surah Al-Baqarah at a sort of a later point. So we'll come back to this later. Next, we have John of Damascus. So this is a famous early Christian author who wrote his, The Heresy of the Ishmaelites, writing in Greek. It's a heresiography. It's written around the 730 CE. And he was connected to the Umayyad court, right? And famously wrote an early sort of polemical description of early Islam. And so he wrote, they were clearly idolaters until the time of Heraclius, from which time a false prophet appeared to them named Muhammad, who chanced upon the Old and New Testaments, and conversing in like manner with an Arian monk, introduced a sect of his own. And on the pretext of having made himself seem a God-fearing person to the people, he reported that a scripture was brought down to him from heaven by God. So having put together some sayings in his book, worthy of laughter, he thus handed the object of wonder down to them. And later on he continues, this Muhammad, as has been said, set down many foolish sayings and put a title on each one, such as the writing of woman. Also the scripture of the heifer, and several other foolish tales worthy of laughter, which, because of their number, I think it necessary to pass over. So John of Damascus is describing all of these different writings, these different compositions that Muhammad produced, including the heifer, right, the cow. And there are some discrepancies between the content that John is attributing to these compositions and the canonical corresponding versions of these texts interpreted by the scholars in question as basically a direct testimony of a kind of diffuse, pre-canonized, pre-collected Quranic corpus as late as, well, the time of John of Damascus, right? As late as around the year 700. Next, we have the Monk of Beth Hale. Again, we have a sort of polemical Christian work. This one is sort of the text is sort of a debate between a Muslim and a Christian. It was written in the late 8th or early 9th century CE. And the author says, I think that for you too, so this is the Christian responding to the Muslim, I think that for you too, not all your laws and commandments are in the Qur'an, which Muhammad taught you. Rather, there are some which he taught you from the Qur'an, and some are in Surah Al-Baqarah, and in Gigi, and in Tawrah. Right? It's left sort of transliterated because the meanings of these words is a bit unclear, but we'll come back to this later on. But for now, it suffices to note that here, in this pretty late source, the Quran and Surah Al-Baqarah, obviously this is Surah Al-Baqarah, are being referred to as separate texts, right? So here we seem to have a direct description of, at a late point, Surah Al-Baqarah is still a free-floating, pre-collected text. Next, we have the Hadith of Al-Amash. So this is a hadith. There are many versions of it. We can trace them back to, for example, Ali ibn Mushir. He is, for those who are sort of familiar, that he is what we call a partial common link, right? So we can trace all these transmissions back to Ali ibn Mushir, the partial common link in Kufa, who's transmitting from Al-Amash, also in Kufa. And this is just a summary of the hadith. Al-Amash heard Al-Hajjaj give a sermon from the pulpit in which he commanded his audience to compose the Quran, Aliful Quran, like it was composed by Gabriel. The surah in which the cow is mentioned, the surah in which the family of Imran are mentioned, the surah in which the women are mentioned. Then Al-Amash mentioned this to Ibrahim al-Nakhai, he's another important early Kufan, and he responded that Abdurrahman ibn Yazid, another even earlier important Kufan, had reported that Ibn Mas'ud, another even earlier important Kufan, had referred to the Surah of the Cow during a pilgrimage ritual at Mina. And so it's argued that this is just a direct description of Al-Hajjaj ordering the scribes to compose the Quran. It's literally Aliful Quran, compose the Quran. And they're bringing together, Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Imran, Surah An-Nisa, right? They're actually, we're getting a snapshot of the late composition process, the collection process of the Quran under Al-Hajjaj, explicitly attested. Or so argues Dubrema et al. Finally, we have what is apparently the smoking gun, which is a papyrus a manuscript that is entirely just Surah Al-Baqarah. This is not a section of an existing, like a larger Quran. It is from beginning to end. It is just self-contained, one surah, Surah Al-Baqarah. And it's written around the year 700 CE. And so this is similar to the canonical text, but it has many variants, something like 40 variants. And so Shoemaker in particular has argued, well, it's the smoking gun, right? This is now we have a physical copy of this Book of the Cow, this free-floating, pre-canonical, pre-collected, Book of the Cow, as late as the year 700, therefore showing that the Quran wasn't yet collected, it wasn't yet canonized, and that it must have only happened finally under Abdul Malik around this time or soon after. So just to summarize, we have the Prophet's rallying cry, which is, again, this is according to the interpretations of the scholars just mentioned, is an attestation of a discrete Surah Al-Baqarah. We have John of Damascus, which is an outright description of this situation in the early 8th century CE. We have the monk of Beth Hale, again, another late description of Surah Al-Baqarah still being this discrete text separate from, not in the Quran. We have the Hadith of Al-Amash, which is an explicit account of Al-Hajjaj collecting all the discrete surahs, including Surah Al-Baqarah, around the year 700 CE. And then we have this papyrus fragment, which is the physical evidence, the final confirmation that there was this free-floating, pre-collected, pre-canonical Surah Al-Baqarah around the year 700, right? So now I want to sort of evaluate these arguments and sort of talk a bit about interpreting the evidence. So it has to be said that, if everything I said is as presented, this is a very strong hypothesis, right? I mean, this is a hypothesis that has a lot of explanatory virtues. I mean, there are multiple independent. It fulfills the criterion of multiple independent attestation, right? It isn't just, there aren't just multiple sources, there are multiple kinds of sources. We have Islamic sources, right? We have like hadiths, we have non-Muslim sources, these early Syriac and Greek. We have a documentary source. It's like different kinds of evidence. It isn't just like multiple reports or something. It's like multiple types of evidence, if you see what I'm saying. The Islamic reports in particular, they fulfill the criterion of dissimilarity, right? They go against the grain. They're depicting the Quran as being collected or composed under al-Hajjaj. That goes against the orthodoxy that it was Uthman. You could also arguably appeal to parsimony and broad explanatory scope. It's a relatively simple explanation that explains a fair amount of evidence. So if all of that is right, if all of that holds up, this is one of the better attested facts of early Islamic history. However, in my opinion, this is a house of cards. All of that, everything I just said is really an illusion. This is sort of like, I don't know the name, but you know those clever illusions where you look at some sort of installation and it looks like, I don't know, it looks like a cat or something. But then when you move to the side, you see, oh, it's just like there's a car, there's a house, there's a tree. And when you overlay them, it kind of, oh, it looks like there's a cat. But then you step to the side and you see, oh, it was just an illusion. This is what we're dealing with here. All of this is pretty much illusory. Each piece of evidence that we just discussed is far more likely to be explained by something else, or just isn't evidence at all, or it's just very, very unlikely to be talking about what it's been taken to be talking about by the scholars in question. This is really a cumulative case based on equivocal and misinterpreted evidence. This is an accumulation of weak evidence. So let's go back through and revisit each piece of evidence. First, we have the Prophet's rallying cry. Again, as I already sort of intimated previously, this is set during the time of the Prophet and the time of Abu Bakr. This is not even putatively a description of the situation in 700 CE. Now, it could be, as in, you could argue, and this is presumably what these scholars are doing, you could argue, oh, these hadiths were created later on, in like, I don't know, around the year 700. And so the people creating the reports kind of have built in their understanding of the current situation into the reports that they created. So Surah Al-Baqarah is still this discrete text on its own. So they're sort of treating it like that in the stories that they're attributing back. That's possible. It's just possible, right? Like that's not what the text is saying. It's not like the text itself is completely equivocal. It could be interpreted that way. It could be interpreted any number of ways, right? It could just be Surah Al-Baqarah was picked out because it's the most substantial section of the Quranic corpus. That's why it's being singled out in the setting where the Quran is not yet canonized, in the time of the Prophet, the time of Abu Bakr. And so, it works perfectly on a different interpretation, if you see what I'm saying. So this is like very weak evidence, and it's also very indirect evidence. Even like, you just have to sort of read a lot into it. By itself, you would never think, oh, this is a description in the year 700 that the Quran is not yet collected or canonized, right? So this is extremely equivocal evidence. Next, we have John of Damascus. John of Damascus is really the best piece of evidence under consideration, actually, in that he is describing a situation that you could interpret in this way, right? He's describing, these different texts that Muhammad produced, and there's some discrepancies between his descriptions of their contents and the canonical one. This is consistent with the Quran is not yet canonized, or the canonical text is not yet collected and canonized in his time, right? That's a possible interpretation of what he's describing, but it's not the only interpretation. I want to revisit what he's saying, and I've sort of changed it just to make the terminology consistent. I've put back in sort of the Greek here. Muhammad reported that a graphe, a writing or scripture, was brought down to him from heaven by God. So having put together some sayings in his Biblos, his book, worthy of laughter, he thus handed down the object of wonder He thus handed the object of wonder down to them. This Muhammad, as has been said, set down many foolish sayings and put a title on each one, such as the graphe of the woman, the graphe of the camel of God, the graphe of the table, also the graphe of the cow. I've changed heifer to cow just to make it clearer. And several other foolish tales worthy of laughter. So we have a biblos, right? A graphe that is a biblos. We have a book that's been handed down from God. And then we have a series of named writings. The woman, the camel of God, the table, the cow. Now, what does that sound like? You have one book, multiple named compositions. This is completely consistent with just being a description of the canonical Quranic text. That's just the normal structure of the Quran. One book, many named compositions. This actually can be read as perfectly consistent with just not a series of discrete, free-floating, pre-canonical, variant, etc., texts. This can just be read as a description of the canonical Quranic text. Now, there are some discrepancies. I mean, he refers to the camel of God, but there is actually a variant name, I think, for Surat al-Shams, which is that it's Surat al-Naqa. This is, even the variant name actually exists in the Islamic tradition as a name for a standard canonical surah. There are some discrepancies in content. He sometimes mentions that this thing is in this surah that actually isn't in the canonical surah, or he mentions one, a story that doesn't actually exist in the Quran but exists in like exegetical hadith. But I mean, so it could be that this is describing a sort of pre-canonical or non-canonical Quranic text, or it could just be that John is misdescribing the Quran. I mean, that is a completely plausible hypothesis, right? John is, just look at what he's saying, worthy of laughter. John is just like trashing this religious tradition. He has no respect for it at all, right? It would be completely understandable, like it'd be completely plausible that John, who is talking about a hostile outsider, a religious tradition that he thinks is total rubbish, that he, misdescribes the situation, that he's not like closely familiar, that he makes mistakes, that he conflates things. That is totally normal. It's like an extremely, like some of these scholars who try to, argue against this and really want to try and say John is so reliable, he's so knowledgeable. Look how carefully he quotes Christian texts, as if like any of that would translate to his careful treatment of a despised outsider, religious tradition that he thinks being cobbled together. Do you see what I'm saying? It just, actually it's totally plausible that John is just describing the canonical Quranic text and at times misdescribing it for whatever reason, because he's not overly familiar, because he's not being careful, because he doesn't care, because he's just, making some mistakes, whatever. Totally plausible. So the evidence of John is completely equivocal. He might be describing pre-canonical, pre-collective Quran and a free-floating Surah Al-Baqarah and so on, or he might just be slightly misdescribing the canonical text, right? Totally equivocal. Also, just a side point, when we think about the broader context of how this evidence is being used, John is writing like decades after Al-Hajjaj. So why Al-Hajjaj is supposed to have produced the canonical text according to these kinds of scholars? Why does John have a pre-canonical text then? Why doesn't John mention Al-Hajjaj? You'd think that would be an amazing thing for him to exploit polemically. Oh, your scripture has been cobbled together recently, in recent memory, in my own lifetime, just a few years ago, by some evil tyrant. You'd think he'd go for that, but he doesn't. Quite mysterious. Next we have the monk of Beth Hale. Again, we just have a misinterpreted text. So what's going on here? First of all, again, we have a text that was composed long after Al-Hajjaj, like 100 years or more after. So it's odd that it's describing, it's describing a free-floating Surah Al-Baqarah from 100 years earlier? Like it's a bit odd on that Hajjajian view. But if we set that aside, as David Taylor points out, the way to understand what's going on here is to understand the subtexts that this text is alluding to. What's happening here is Muhammad, the Muslims are being accused of deriving their doctrine from 4 sources. The Quran, which Muhammad, is from Muhammad, Surah Al-Baqarah, the Gospel, the Torah, right? So why is Surah Al-Baqarah being distinguished from the Quran? Earlier in this story, there is a reference to the legend of Sergius Bahira. The idea is that, obviously in the early Islamic tradition, there's this story that Muhammad, and there's different variants of the story, but at a certain age, Muhammad visits Syria, and then a monk sees him and recognizes that he's the true prophet. He's got the special signs, he's got the special birthmark, he's got the cloud following him, etc. And so he then affirms that Muhammad is a true prophet, and this is obviously an edifying, miraculous tale that, strengthens the faith and so on. When this story then spread to early Christians, they undertook a polemical borrowing. They took that story, they reworked it, and they inverted it, and they said, this monk is the guy who told Muhammad everything he knew. This is the guy who gave Muhammad religious material, and so in other words, Islam springs from some heretic monk. And so in some of those stories, it's specified that he put together a writing that he puts on the horn of a cow. Obviously, this is Surah Al-Baqarah, right? In other words, there is an established early Christian polemical legend that Surah Al-Baqarah in particular is from the monk. And this text previously alludes to that legend, the legend of that monk. So we have a perfectly reasonable explanation here. The Quran is from Muhammad, so Muslims are getting their doctrine from the Quran, from Muhammad, from Surah Al-Baqarah, from Bahira the monk, from the Gospel, and from the Torah. Now it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, it can't be a coincidence that this specifies Surah Al-Baqarah and also previously refers to Bahira, and it just so happens to be the case that there's a pre-existing, well-established Christian legend about Bahira giving Muhammad Surah Al-Baqarah. It's just unlikely to be a coincidence. Clearly, this text is referring to that legend. And so that explains why Surah Al-Baqarah is being distinguished from the Quran. This has nothing to do with the later state of the Quran after Muhammad or after Uthman or whatever in the year 700. It's not a description of that, which wouldn't even make sense anyway, because the text is composed a further 100 years after that. This is just a description of where Muslim doctrines have ultimately come from, including the idea that some of the Quran actually came from this monk. Next, we have the Hadith of Al-Amash. This one's quite interesting. I'm really puzzled how this hadith was interpreted the way that it is. So the hadith has this thing about Al-Hajjaj, right? Al-Hajjaj says compose the Quran, and he is using the word compose, right? Aliful Quran, compose the Quran. This word ta'lif, right, which is the verbal noun, is used synonymously with jam', collect, right? It's true. So it can be, it is sometimes used to describe the collection of the Quran. Okay, so that's true, right? But then you look at the rest of this, right? The surah in which the cow is mentioned. Why is that wording used? Why does Al-Hajjaj say a surah allati tudhkaru fiha al-Baqarah? The surah in which the cow is mentioned. Why that wording? Why not Surah Al-Baqarah? That's very weird wording, right? Okay, well, on this interpretation, there isn't really an explanation. It's just an interesting curiosity. And then we have to ask, why is it then that we have this anecdote at the end about Ibn Mas'ud doing a Hajj pilgrimage, a Hajj ritual? Normally the end of a story has some sort of connection to the beginning of the story. But on this interpretation, it's just random. It's just Al-Hajjaj orders people to collect the Quran. Oh, and then here's a random anecdote about Ibn Mas'ud, on Hajj. What's the connection? It's just baffling, right? On that interpretation, on this sort of Dupremar and so on's interpretation of this text, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense of the text. It's a bad explanation. Here's what actually makes sense of the text. This is not about the collection of the Quran. That is a misinterpretation. This is about a debate over the formal titling of surahs. Do surahs have formal titles? Is the second surah in the canon, does it have a formal title? Is it the surah of the cow, Surah Al-Baqarah? Or should you refer to it in a more indirect way, the surah in which the cow is mentioned? That's what this is about. That explains the ending, because the ending of the story is a response to the beginning. Al-Hajjaj is being made to support the view that surahs do not have formal titles. The Kufans don't like this, they're responding, and they are refuting. Ibn Mas'ud, the preeminent early Kufan authority, is being cited because already back in time, previously before Al-Hajjaj, he, according to this anecdote, was already saying the Surah of the Cow. It already had a formal title years earlier. And so for the Kufan audience, in which this is all transmitted by Kufans, that this is an authoritative refutation of this view that they reject, the view that surahs shouldn't have formal titles. That's what this hadith is about. It's not a description of the Quran being collected or composed. And so this is further, there's other aspects of this as well. Like Al-Hajjaj is addressing a general audience here. He's giving a khutbah from the minbar. He's in the main mosque of Kufa. He's just addressing a general audience. He's not addressing a scriptorium. Also, there are parallel versions of this hadith that make it clearer. Not to mention, there are other hadiths that actually take the opposite view that was transmitted amongst early Basrans. So we know that this was an early debate that existed, and they're using the same kind of language, they're using the same kind of rhetoric, but on both sides, right? So we can clearly see the debate that this material belongs to, and it's not a debate over the collection of the Quran, it's a debate over whether or not you give formal titles to surahs. It's just to illustrate the co-transmissions. So the version that we were looking at is this one, of the partial common link, Ali ibn Mushir, right? So just imagine that there's a further sort of network of transmissions from Ali. Here he's a partial common link. The same for Ad-Dawraqi and Sufyan ibn Uyayna. I should have indicated this. These are both partial common links. So this is reconstructed, okay? And here you can see, yes, Ali has this thing about, compose the Quran, right? Aliful Quran. And so does this one co-transmission attested by Abu Awana back to Al-A'mash, right? So maybe it goes back to Al-A'mash. Maybe he did say this, has this element about composing the Quran, or maybe it was introduced by Ali, and then because this version went on to become popular and ended up in Sahih Muslim in a canonical Sunni collection and so on, maybe it contaminated this version. It's not going to really make a difference. But here we have 3 co-transmissions from Al-A'mash that do not have the composed element. They don't have that element about compose the Quran like Gabriel composed it. They don't have that. They're much simpler. This is the original version of the hadith. This is the simpler version, the less elaborated version. So whether or not Al-A'mash is responsible for this more elaborate secondary version or not, the point is, this is the original. This is likely the earlier version. And in all of these versions, there's no mention of composing the Quran, Alif al-Quran, nothing. It's just Al-Hajjaj says, say the surah in which the cow is mentioned. Or he says, don't say Surah Al-Baqarah, say the surah in which the cow is mentioned. That's it. There's nothing else about ta'lif or anything. This is just about the debate over the formal titling of surahs. And so, of course, why then do some versions have this thing about ta'lif, compose the Quran, what's going on in this? This is actually likely reflecting a secondary debate. So we have the original hadith is about the debate over the titling of surahs. This version, the version of Ali ibn Mushir, and also this co-transmission recorded by Abu Awana. So this version is probably bringing in a second debate, which is the debate over the order of the surahs. The canonical order, the Uthmanic order, the order that is supported by Al-Hajjaj, both historically and in this report, is that first it's Surah Al-Baqarah. It's the cow, then it's Surah Al-Imran, then it's Surah An-Nisa. So it's the cow, then the family of Imran, then the women. But in the version of the Quran that's attributed to Ibn Mas'ud and that was popular among many early Kufans, there's a different order. It's the cow, then the women, then the family of Imran. And so we have here a debate over the order of surahs. It's not about collecting the Quran. It's about what is the correct order of surahs in the manuscript, right? And so the issue, in other words, what I'm arguing is that ta'lif here is not like jama', it's not like collect, it's more like tartib, it's arrangement, right? And by the way, Abu Hilal al-Askari explicitly mentions this, that there is an overlap in meaning. He sort of goes through the meanings of ta'lif, jama', tartib, and he notes that there is an overlap between, there are differences, but there are also similarities. There's some ways in which ta'lif can be used differently, but there's also an overlap in meaning. So ta'lif can mean tartib, even according to the grammarians. So this is likely the why the word ta'lif is being used here. Because we have, again, we have a Kufan hadith that is dragging in a secondary issue that was also known to be debated in Kufa, and that explains what is going on with ta'lif in this hadith. It's an initial debate over surah titles, in which Ibn Mas'ud, and then a secondary debate has been grafted in, and Ibn Mas'ud's surah order, favored by the Kufans, has been sort of dragged in, and Al-Hajjaj is being made to condemn that, and obviously the Kufans support that. Now, one quick note here. The version that we were looking at is the one that we can trace back to Ali ibn Mushir, right? Back to this figure here. So in other words, if I go back, if you see this version here, Ali ibn Mushir, this is the network of transmissions back to Ali. And so in most versions, all these transmissions back to Ali ibn Mushir, the Al-Hajjaj is attributed the canonical order. He says the surah in which the cow is mentioned, the surah in which the family of Imran are mentioned, the surah in which the women are mentioned. But there is one version from the Pasha Common Link, Minjab ibn al-Harith, where the order is switched, right? It's the cow, then the women, then Ali Imran. What's happened here is that in this version, because the author knows that the issue being alluded to with Al-Hajjaj is Ibn Mas'ud versus Uthman. It's there's the secondary issue of the debate over the order of surahs that's been dragged in. He's accidentally got his wires crossed, and he's put into Al-Hajjaj's mouth the Ibn Mas'udic order. So in the version that's then attested by Al-Bayhaqi and also in the Sahih of Muslim, Al-Hajjaj is actually made to advocate the Ibn Mas'udic surah order, right? Which is totally historically implausible and also is actually contradicted by all these other code transmissions from the Pasha Common Link. So clearly Minjab has made a mistake. Why did he make that mistake? Because he understood that this was actually about Uthman versus Ibn Mas'ud, this sort of secondary version that mentions Aliful Qur'an. And so he accidentally got his wires crossed. And so we have further evidence here in the mistake that's being made. We have, it's explained by understanding what the issue was about, and that the author, the Pasha Common Link, has accidentally crossed his wires with that knowledge in mind. Okay. Finally, we have the papyrus manuscript. Immediately, this is equivocal. I mean, this could easily just be a specialized manuscript that was copied out for legal purposes. It could just be a legal extract. Someone specifically copied out this surah because it has, it's like a vademecum, right? It's like an extract for legal purposes, for teaching purposes, whatever. So it might be a free-floating early, pre-canonical, non-canonical Surah Al-Baqarah, or it might just be an extract from the canon, from the canonical text. In fact, this is very likely because this text is the canonical text. This is the canonical text of Surah Al-Baqarah. This is the Uthmanic text. I mentioned that there's variation. The variation is literally at the level of standard scribal error. I want you to think about how implausible how unlikely that is on the view that this is actually a pre-canonical text, right? Like, what are the odds that there was this, pre-canonical, free-floating, pre-collected variant sort of Baqarah floating around, and it just so happens that the level of difference between it and the canonical text is exactly the level that would be produced if this was just copied from the canonical text. I mean, it's bizarre, right? I mean, it's just very unlikely. This is not like the level of variation here is nothing like what you have with the San'a manuscript, the palimpsest, which is actually a pre-canonical text, or what's attributed to Ibn Mas'ud. It's nothing like that. This is just the differences between this extract, this Surah Al-Baqarah, and the canonical text is literally just at the level of standard scribal error. That is not what it would look like if this was a pre-canonical, free-floating, etc., text. This is exactly what it would look like if this was just an extract, a copy from the canonical text. So this is just, very unlikely to be this alleged free-floating, pre-canonical, pre-collected Surah Al-Baqarah. Okay, so final question. Why then is Al-Baqarah being picked out, right? Because a part of the appeal of this argument is the amazing coincidence that Surah Al-Baqarah keeps being seemingly singled out as its own text, or as a separate text, or as having a separate origin, or here it is in its own manuscript. So why? Here we come back to what I mentioned at the very beginning about the basic features of Surah Al-Baqarah. It's the first main surah. After the opener, it's Surah Al-Baqarah as far as the eye can see. It's the longest surah. It has a huge amount of legal content. It makes perfect sense that if you were to talk about the history of the Quran, or to pick out a section of the Quran, or or in like if you're an early Christian polemically creating a story and you want to say parts of the Quran are from a monk, Surah Al-Baqarah is the obvious one to pick out, or it is an obvious one to pick out. And so we have a perfectly good explanation for why Al-Baqarah is kind of singled out in these various contexts that doesn't require us to suppose that as late as the year 700, there was a free-floating, pre-collected, pre-canonical variant Surah Al-Baqarah, whizzing around early Muslim society. So just to summarize, the Prophet's rallying cry, completely equivocal. There's no indication here of a proto-canonical free-floating surahs as late as the year 700. It doesn't describe that. It's totally equivocal. It might indirectly imply that, but it doesn't describe that. Next, we have John of Damascus. Again, totally equivocal. It's consistent with just being a somewhat misdescribed canonical text. We have the monk of Beth Hali. This is just very likely misinterpreted. It's likely just referring to a Christian legend about how Muhammad got Surah Al-Baqarah from the monk Bahira. We have the Hadith of Al-A'mash. Again, this has just been misinterpreted. It's very likely originally a debate over surah titles, and then in a secondary version, the issue of Ibn Mas'ud's surah order sort of got mixed into it. It is not describing Al-Hajjaj composing the Quran or anything like that. Finally, we have the papyrus manuscript. Again, it's likely misinterpreted. This is very likely a product of the canonical text. It is a copy of the canonical text of Surah Al-Baqarah. So, in conclusion, what we have is an accumulation of weak and misinterpreted evidence, right? Essentially, to put it maybe a bit glibly, 5 times 0 equals 0. All of these amazing different points of evidence turn out to be weak, equivocal, etc. They all add up to a completely weak and equivocal conclusion. Or to be generous, okay, so in the case of John, right, maybe it's not 0, right? Maybe we can say it's a possible 1. Because John is really, he is describing a Quranic text. There are some differences between what he's describing and what we have. You could interpret that as maybe there is some sort of variant text, or maybe John is misdescribing it. It could go either way. Right? All else being equal, I mean. As we're about to see, all else is not equal. But if all else were equal, you could go either way. So we have a possible 1 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals a possible 1. All the other evidence is extremely weak, extremely misinterpreted, etc., etc. But I'm not denying that you could interpret some of the evidence in this way, but it's very sort of weak evidence overall, and especially when you set it against all of the contrary evidence, which I haven't gone into in this presentation, but which will all be discussed in my forthcoming series with Jiqsa, which is, there are multiple early common links, early common sources, let's just say, of hadiths in multiple regions. Abu Ishaq in Kufa, Az-Zuhri in Medina and Syria. You've got Ibn Sirin in Basra, and you've got others as well. Some people in Egypt, others in Basra, etc. All attesting in different versions with different stories, with different details, all contradictory, but all agreeing on the basic point. Uthman canonized the Quran. You've got trans-sectarian agreement. You've got early Sunni sources, early Shi'i sources, Ibadis. They all agree it was Uthman, including against the interests of some of those groups who hate and despise Uthman, but nevertheless agree that yes, he's the one who canonized the Quran. We have manuscript and stematic evidence that matches key reports about the Uthmanic canonization. We have multiple C14 dated and paleographically dated, both dated pre the time of Al-Hajjaj and Abdul Malik. We have overwhelming evidence that Uthman canonized the Quran, which absolutely finishes off this idea, even if the weakness of the evidence itself wasn't enough to sort of undermine this hypothesis. So that's it.